I remember the first time I noticed him. It was a dull afternoon, one of those ordinary, rainy days that made everything feel heavier. My husband, Jack, had been at work, as he always was, buried in his spreadsheets and phone calls. I, on the other hand, had my own little routine, a quiet house, a cup of tea, the hum of the radio. The day felt like it would pass in the same way all the others had. But then he entered the room. His name was Daniel, a colleague of Jack's, invited to our home for a small dinner. I hadn't thought much about it at first. Jack often had guests, and I hadn't seen the need to prepare anything extraordinary. But when Daniel walked in, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, something I couldn't quite place. His presence was different from the others. He wasn't loud or overtly charming. No, it was something quieter. A stillness that made me uneasy. I tried to push the feeling aside, smiled as he shook my hand, told myself it was nothing. But then he looked at me. Really looked at me. And for a split second, it was as if the world around us had blurred into the background. His gaze was steady, like he was trying to unravel the very fabric of who I was, as if there were something hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be discovered. I quickly looked away, a flush creeping up my neck. Ridiculous, I told myself. He was just a man. But still, I couldn't shake the way his eyes lingered. I went back to the kitchen, telling myself it was nothing, trying to focus on the sounds of the stove, the quiet clink of silverware. That night, I tried to push the memory of his gaze out of my mind. I told myself I was imagining things. Jack and I had been together for years now. Our marriage was solid, dependable. It wasn't perfect, but it was built on trust and routine, and that was enough, wasn't it? What could someone like Daniel, just a fleeting acquaintance, possibly offer that I didn't already have? Yet, despite the reasoning, the thought of him wouldn't leave me. I couldn't help but replay that brief moment when his eyes met mine, when I felt something stir inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. It was a tiny flicker of something unfamiliar, curiosity, maybe, or desire. But it was enough to make me question what I had long since taken for granted. I pushed it aside. But it wasn't easy. The next few days passed in an odd sort of haze. I went about my usual routine, but something felt off, like I was holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. Every time I saw Daniel, I felt that same quiet unease, like a thread was pulling me toward him, and I couldn't quite resist it. We would exchange the briefest of pleasantries at work functions, in the kitchen, or in passing. He was always polite, but there was an intensity in his presence. He had a way of looking at me that was so different from Jack's gaze, so much more deliberate. Like he wasn't just seeing me as a woman, but something he wanted to understand, to reach, to unravel. I caught myself thinking about it often. Sometimes it was in the moments when Jack wasn't home, when the house was quiet, and I was left to my own thoughts. I'd find myself remembering how Daniel's voice sounded when he asked about my childhood, his eyes never leaving mine, as if every word I spoke mattered more than it should have. But it was his touch that began to linger in my mind more than anything. The first time our hands brushed, I remember how my skin tingled, how it felt as though an electric current had passed between us. I tried to laugh it off, tell myself it was just a casual thing, but it stayed with me long after. I couldn't explain it, that connection, or maybe I didn't want to. It didn't make sense. I had Jack, a man who had been my constant, my partner, my safe place. We had built a life together, a solid, dependable life. But with Daniel, there was a spark I hadn't realized I had been missing, a part of me that I didn't know was dormant until it awakened with just a glance, a smile, a casual brush of fingertips. It was in those quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, that I began to question everything. Was it wrong to feel something for him? Was it disloyal to entertain the idea that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than what I had built with Jack? But I pushed those thoughts away, buried them deep, because I knew, deep down, what I had with Jack was real. It was lasting. We had years together. We had shared memories. But there was this yearning inside me now, something I had forgotten how to feel. A longing that had nothing to do with Jack, and everything to do with something else, something dangerous, something uncertain. I knew I shouldn't want it, but I couldn't deny the way it pulled at me. One evening, after an event at work, Jack had to stay late. I stayed behind, not wanting to wait in the empty house. When I walked into the living room, I found Daniel there, sitting on the couch, waiting. He was alone, relaxed, with a glass of wine in his hand. "I didn't expect you to still be here," I said, surprised but not entirely uncomfortable. "Jack's tied up with something, and I didn't want to leave before saying goodbye," he replied, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. We exchanged a few words, casual at first, but then the silence settled in between us, thick and heavy. I sat down across from him, keeping my distance, but I could feel the weight of his presence, the intensity of the moment that neither of us seemed willing to break. It was in that silence that I felt it again, the pull, the draw toward him. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something unspoken but undeniable. "I never told you," he said softly, his voice low, almost a whisper. "You have this way about you. It's rare." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to brush it off. But the other part of me, the part that was longing for something more, for something different, wanted to stay there in that moment and let the words linger. "You're not what I expected," he continued, his eyes searching mine, holding me there with an intensity that made my heart beat just a little faster. "You're more than I thought." It wasn't a declaration of anything, not exactly, but it felt like one. A quiet admission, a recognition of something I hadn't fully understood until that moment. And though I could hear the voice in the back of my head reminding me of my vows, of the life I had built, of the man who still loved me, I couldn't ignore the pull. It wasn't that I wanted to betray Jack. It was that I didn't know if I was still the woman who had promised to love him forever. And for the first time in years, I felt a shift deep inside me. I wasn't sure what it meant yet, but I couldn't deny it anymore. Something had changed. The days blurred together, each one like the last. I tried to find comfort in the familiar rhythm of my life with Jack, but it felt hollow now. His presence, his touch, didn't stir the same warmth they once had. The space between us had grown wide, filled with quiet tension that neither of us spoke about. Then there was Daniel. He lingered in my thoughts, more present than he should have been. The subtle way he looked at me, his smile that lingered a little too long, the way he made me feel seen, it all left me restless, longing for something I couldn't quite define. One evening, after a dull dinner with Jack, I sat in our living room. Jack was lost in the paper in front of him, his eyes dull with exhaustion, while Daniel's image danced in my mind. I wondered what it would feel like to leave this routine, to leave behind the life I had carefully built. What would it be like to choose Daniel, to chase that pull I couldn't resist? As Jack kissed me goodnight, I could barely return the gesture. His touch felt so distant, like I was just going through the motions. That night, in bed beside him, I realized how far apart we'd drifted. My heart ached, not for the loss of Jack, but for the woman I had become, a woman unsure of her own heart. The next morning, as I left for work, Jack kissed me goodbye, but I felt nothing. When I arrived at the office, Daniel's gaze found mine immediately. That same pull was there. I tried to focus, to convince myself that everything was fine, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I was torn between two lives, one built with Jack, stable but suffocating, and one with Daniel, unknown but alive with possibility. I didn't know who I was anymore or what I truly wanted. And for the first time, I realized I might never know the answer.